A politician can negotiate a ceasefire. A religious leader can reach the community that decides whether it will hold, whether to honor it or not. A diplomat can sign an agreement. A religious leader can help change the story that the community tells about why the enemy is human. Welcome to the Meaning Mindset with Rabbi Ron Lee Paz. We are generously supported this season by Dr. Jack and Beth Lynn. Now, I want to make an argument today. It's not a quiet suggestion. It's not a both sides reflection. It's an actual argument. And the argument is this: religion is not the enemy of peace. In fact, and I want to be precise here, religion, when practiced with integrity, may be the most powerful and underutilized force for peace that human civilization has ever produced. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking about history, the Crusades, the Inquisition, sectarian violence in Northern Ireland, in the Middle East today, in South Asia. You're thinking about extremism deployed in the name of God, the bombers, the zealots, the people who have done terrible things while invoking the divine. I'm not going to wave those away. They happened, they are happening, they are real. But I am going to argue with evidence and with the weight of my own experience that those things are not what religion is. They are what happens when religion is hijacked, when it's stripped of its ethical core and weaponized for political ends. And I'm going to argue that conflating the hijacking with the tradition itself, deciding that because religion has been misused, it must therefore be dangerous, is one of the most consequential intellectual errors of our time. Because here's what that error costs us. It costs us the very instrument that might actually help. There's a story told about religion and violence in mainstream Western discourse. It goes roughly like this. Religion divides people into the saved and the damned, the pure and the impure, the believers and the heretics. That division creates hierarchy. Hierarchy, we know, creates resentment. Resentment, when political conditions are right, ignites into violence. Therefore, religion is a root cause of war. That's an argument. It's a clean story. It has the appeal of a simple explanation. It's also, when examined seriously, largely wrong. The political scientist William Kavanaugh spent years studying what he calls the myth of religious violence, the assumption that religion is uniquely prone to generating lethal conflict. What he found, digging into the actual historic record, is that most of the wars commonly cited as religious wars were driven primarily by political and economic interests, with religion functioning as a legitimating vocabulary rather than a genuine cause. The 30-Year War, often held up as the defining example of religion tearing Europe apart, was in significant measure a struggle over the political power of the Holy Roman Empire. Catholic France allied with Protestant states against Catholic Spain. That's not theology, that's geopolitics wearing a cross. The conflicts in Northern Ireland were not at their root about theological disagreements between Catholics and Protestants. They were about boundary and territory, land, political representation, economic marginalization, a century of colonial resentment. Religion was the badge of tribal identity. It was not the engine of the war. The violence across the Middle East today is not primarily a dispute about the nature of God or which face of God. It's about human power, and we know that. It's about resources. It's about unresolved legacies of colonialism and the drawing of borders that cut across the actual human communities who live there. Now, I'm not saying that religion plays no role. That would be naive. I'm saying that it is almost never the root cause, and consistently treating it as such is both historically inaccurate and strategically disastrous. Because if you misdiagnose the disease, you cannot prescribe the cure. Let me tell you what I think religion actually is at its best, at its core, in the traditions that I know deeply and the ones that I've had the privilege of studying. Religion is a technology for making human beings more fully human. Not a perfect technology, not a technology without dangers, but a technology nonetheless, a set of practices, narratives, communities, and obligations designed to do something that no other human institution does quite the same way: to place the individual within a story larger than themselves, to create obligations that transcend self-interest, to insist that the stranger has a claim on you, to make the ethical demand not just intellectually attractive, but emotionally compelling and communally reinforced. In the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, my foundational text, the most repeated ethical commandment, appearing in more forms than any other, is this: do not oppress the stranger, for you were the stranger in the land of Egypt. Now, that logic is extraordinary. The foundation of Jewish ethics is not abstract in its principle. It's memory. It's the requirement to remember what it felt like to be vulnerable, to be powerless, to be at the mercy of someone else's willingness to see your humanity or not. And from that memory, to never be the one who fails to see humanity in another. That's not a teaching that produces violence. That's a teaching specifically designed to prevent it. Islam, at its core, means submission to God. It encompasses a profound tradition of justice, of hospitality, and the protection of the vulnerable. The Quran speaks more than any other major scripture of God's mercy. The Arabic word for mercy, rahmah, appears in virtually every chapter. The Prophet Muhammad is described not as a warrior first, but as mercy to all the world. Christianity, at its theological heart, is a tradition built on the radical equality of all human beings before God, regardless of social station, nationality, or origin. Its central ethical demand is, from the Torah, from the Talmud, to love your neighbor. Its most challenging demand, to love your enemy. These aren't the teachings of traditions that want or promote war. These are the teachings of traditions that know in their bones what war costs, and that build ethical systems specifically designed to resist the human impulse toward tribalism and domination. The problem isn't the traditions. The problem is what happens when the traditions are reduced to tribal identifiers, when they become team jerseys rather than moral obligations, when the question is no longer what does my tradition ask or demand of me, but what does my tradition say about them, the other. That reduction is always a betrayal of the tradition, always, in every case. I want to step back from the argument for a moment and tell you what I've actually witnessed. I have stood in rooms and sat in rooms at the United Nations, in Istanbul, in Baku, in Fez, in Washington, where leaders from traditions have been at war with each other for centuries, where we sat together, listened to each other, and found beneath the differences something that all of us recognized. I've sat in the presence, in the home of His All Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch, Bartholomew, the spiritual leader of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and we spoke about our shared obligations to the earth, to one another, to the generations that will come after us. We weren't performing tolerance. We were doing theology together. It's one of the most alive conversations I've ever had. I've been welcomed as a Jew and a rabbi into Muslim communities all over the globe, into Catholic communities, into spaces where I was the only person from my tradition in the room. And I've been received not as a curiosity, but as a colleague, as a brother, as someone who, from a different set of stories and practices, was pursuing the same thing. I was honored to be received by Pope Francis as an honored guest at the Vatican. And what struck me, beyond the remarkable beauty of that encounter, was the quality of his attention. He wasn't performing, he was present. His presence was shaped unmistakably by a lifetime of religious practice that made him genuinely interested in the person in front of him. And that's what religion can produce. That's what it does produce when it's lived rather than weaponized. And I want to be honest with you, I've seen this not just at the highest levels of interreligious diplomacy. I've seen it in a synagogue parking lot where a Muslim family or Muslim couple whose car broke down was surrounded by, within minutes, Jewish community, congregants who gave up their Friday evening to help them. And I've seen it in a hospital setting, in a room where a Catholic chaplain sat with a Jewish patient whose own rabbi couldn't get there in time and prayed with her in a way that honored what she believed. These things happen every day in communities all over the world. They don't make the news. Violence in the name of religion makes the news. Cooperation in the name of religion feeds people, builds hospitals, runs schools, shelters refugees, and buries the dead with dignity. And we barely notice. That imbalance in our attention is costing us our ability to think clearly about what religion actually is and what religion actually contributes, what it does in our world. Let me make the positive argument directly. Religious leaders have access that political leaders do not have, full stop. A politician can negotiate a ceasefire. A religious leader can reach the community that decides whether it will hold, whether to honor it or not. A diplomat can sign an agreement. A religious leader can help change the story that the community tells about why the enemy is human. This isn't theory. The evidence is substantial and growing. In Mozambique, after nearly 2 decades of devastating civil war, the community of Sant'Egidio, a Catholic lay community based in Rome, mediated a peace agreement. 1992, when all the governmental efforts failed, they had relationships. They had trust. They had accountability. They had authority. They had the moral authority that comes from communities who had been present in the country throughout the war, serving the poor without a political agenda. I've spoken quite a lot about Rwanda. In the aftermath of the 1994 genocide, one of the most catastrophic human events of the modern era, the rebuilding of the community across the Hutu-Tutsi divide, has been supported significantly by religious reconciliation processes. Churches that failed catastrophically during the genocide have also been sites of some of the most profound work of restoration. In Northern Ireland, I mentioned earlier, religious figures, particularly on the Catholic side in that case, were critical in creating the social permission for the community to accept the peace process. Political negotiators could write the Good Friday Agreement, but only trusted community leaders could make ordinary people believe it was safe to try. And in conflict zones across the world today, in Colombia, in South Sudan, in parts of Southeast Asia, religious networks are doing the patient, unglamorous, essential work of keeping communications alive across lines that political actors cannot cross. None of this is because religious leaders are saints. Well, maybe some are, but most are not. It's because religious communities are the deepest roots many people have. When everything else has been stripped away, when political institutions have collapsed, when economic systems have failed, when the social contract has been shredded, the mosque, the synagogue, the church, the temple is still there. The community is still there. And that's not a small thing. That's the most durable social infrastructure human civilizations have ever built. And we are, in much of the secular West, walking away from it, that institution, with no more than a shrug. Well, I owe you honesty, and honesty requires me to say this. Religious institutions have done terrible things. Specific, documented, unambiguous things, the sexual abuse of children by clergy, and the institutional cover-ups that allowed that to continue. That's a profound moral catastrophe. It's driven millions of people away from traditions that failed them at the deepest possible level. The anger isn't just justified, it's correct. It's the correct response. The use of religious authority to enforce caste hierarchies, to justify slavery, to suppress the rights of women, to persecute LGBTQ people, these are not aberrations that can fully be quarantined from the traditions. They're failures. And they're failures that must be owned and examined and reckoned with. Extremism that murders in the name of God, whether the murderers are Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, it's not merely a political problem with a religious label. It's a theological problem. It's a problem of understanding and belief. And the response for that, it requires a theological response. And the responsibility for that response belongs first and most urgently to the religious communities themselves and those leaders. I say all of that not to undermine the argument that I'm making, but because the argument cannot be made credibly without it. The case for religion as a force for peace is not a case for religious institutions, just as they often exist. It's a case for the traditions at their best, and a demand that religious communities hold themselves accountable to the standards their own teachings require. We have failed those standards repeatedly, sometimes catastrophically. And the response to that failure cannot be to abandon the traditions. The response is to return to the core, to ask, what does the tradition actually demand? To refuse to let the tradition be used as a weapon, especially when the people wielding it are inside our own communities. That work is harder than walking away. It requires staying in the room when something you love has disappointed you. I think it's the work of this particular moment in time. So what does any of this mean for you, wherever you are, whatever your relationship is to religion? I want to offer three things. The first is to challenge. It's a challenge to the secular assumption. If you've walked away from religion, if you were never part of it, I'm not asking you to come back or to come back in. That's your life. That's your choice. But I'm asking you to examine whether the dismissal of religion as inherently dangerous, the comfortable secular certainty that the world would be more peaceful without it, is actually as well-founded as it feels. Because the 20th century, the most violent in human history, was also the century of the most explicitly secular ideologies: Nazism, Stalinism, Maoism. None of those were religious movements. All of them required absolute devotion, a sacred narrative, a chosen people, and an enemy who was less than human. It turns out that the impulse toward tribalism, toward sacred violence, toward the dehumanization of the other, that impulse is not religious. We have to come to terms with the fact that it is simply human. And removing religion does not remove the impulse. It merely removes one of the most powerful available counterforces. Well, the second is a challenge to the religious assumption. If you are religious, if you're part of a tradition, if you pray, if you practice, I'm asking you to take seriously your own tradition's call to the other. Not the other who looks like you, not the other who agrees with you. I'm talking about the stranger, the one your community has historically feared or dismissed or alienated or ignored. Every major tradition has this call at its center. Do not let it become a decorative verse. Let it be the moral, demanding instruction in your practice. The third challenge is a challenge for all of us, religious or not. The most important conversations happening in the world right now about violence, about justice, about what human beings owe one another, these are conversations that are being conducted largely in the absence of religious wisdom. Policy without ethics. Technology without theology, politics without the long view the traditions carry. The result is a kind of moral short-sightedness, decisions made with no frame larger than the next election cycle, the next quarterly report, the next news cycle. Religious communities, when they are functioning as they should, carry something rare, a commitment to the long arc, a memory that extends further back than living experience, a responsibility to people who are not yet born. That's not an ornament. That is a form of wisdom the world is desperately short of. I began with an argument. Let me end with hope. I've spent the better part of 3 decades in rooms where people from different traditions talk to one another, carefully, honestly, sometimes painfully. And what I've seen in those rooms has convinced me of something that I cannot shake. When religious people take their own traditions seriously, not as tribal badges, but as moral obligations, they become among the most powerful forces for human connection that exist. Not because they agree on everything, they never will, but because they share something more fundamental than agreement. The conviction that human beings are not accidents. That every person carries an irreducible dignity. That we're accountable to one another and to something larger than ourselves for how we treat one another. That shared conviction drawn from different wells is the foundation on which real peace will be built. not the peace of managed conflict, not the peace of kept apart communities who tolerate each other at a safe distance, but the peace of actual relationship, of people who have sat across from genuine difference and found in that difference not a threat, but something else, an invitation. Isaiah, my tradition's great prophet of peace, looked at a world of war and oppression and saw something else. He saw the possibility of a day when nations would stream toward one another. He saw a world of peace that would come out of a world of oppression. He saw the possibility that one day when the nations would stream toward one another, when swords would be turned into plowshares, when nation would not lift up sword against nation, neither would they learn war anymore. He didn't say it was inevitable. He said it was possible. I believe it's possible, not because I'm naive about human nature. I've buried too many people to be naive of it. But because I've seen with my own eyes what happens when human beings actually look at each other, when the tradition's deepest demand is taken seriously, when we refuse to let the worst uses of religion be the definition of what religion is. Religion is not the enemy of peace. In the right hands, your hands, our hands, if we're willing, it's among the most essential architects of it.
This season is produced and edited by Jonah Lee Paz. Content editing by Bronwyn Lee Paz. Digital marketing by Notebook Media. The Meaning Mindset is hosted by Rabbi Ron Lee Paz. Find us wherever you find your podcasts.